Welcome to another episode of our OECD education podcast, Top Class. I'm Marilyn, editor at the OECD's Directorate for Education and Skills. Another International Women's Day, another story about girls and women not realizing their potential, this time in digital savoir-faire. To quote an American baseball legend, it feels like déjà vu all over again. With me today to talk about something that is known as the digital gender gap are Francesca Borgonovi, senior analyst, and Luca Marcolin, economist, both at the OECD. I hate to admit it, guys, but I'm beginning to get discouraged. Girls don't enroll in STEM studies, even when they do just as well as boys in math and science. Women hit glass ceilings in the workforce, especially in the tech industries. There's even a gender gap, apparently, in internet use. And I thought the internet was supposed to be the great democratizer. So, Francesca, Luca, what is going on?
Well, thank you very much for having me today. I do think that we all thought that computerization and the automation that result from digital technologies would reshape the opportunities for women to access the labor market and excel in the labor market by reshaping the skills that are awarded. But at the same time, we do see that some of the long-standing factors that prevented many women before to enter and succeed in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields of study and occupation are actually hindering their progress precisely in the set of skills that are most important in the labor markets of the 21st century.
Like what kind of skills you're talking about?
I'm thinking very specifically about problem-solving abilities and digital literacy. What we do know from the Program for International Student Assessment study that was conducted in 2012 and assessed students' proficiency in complex problem-solving in digital platforms is that girls at the age of 15 tend to lag behind boys of the same age in complex problem solving. In other words, working on problems that require individuals to engage in fast-paced decision making and to react to dynamically changing problem situations that require individuals, for example, to rely on their intuition and, in a sense, integrate information from complex environments in a digital format. We do know that there are big differences in terms of spatial abilities. It is a question that psychologists and education specialists are examining in terms of trying to find the root causes, whether, for example, they are linked to different patterns of play to try and identify some of the factors that may contribute to such gaps. And it has been shown that, for example, engaging in video gaming can reduce some of the gender gaps. So these are definitely not stable. And what the PISA study has revealed is that they differ greatly across countries. So even if there is a gap in favor of boys in some of these skills, the size of the gap differs greatly across countries, and it's actually not that large, and it can be bridged. So the issue is to what extent education systems, but also societies and educators are actually contributing rather than helping to close such gaps. And that's the question we need to ask ourselves.
And Luca, do you find even in the adult world, in the economy itself, that this is being played out, that once girls sort of begin either stepping back themselves or being prevented from continuing in the sphere, that it just basically the gap widens and widens.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for having me here today, in particular to bring the perspective of a different directorate, the Science, Technology and Innovation Directorate. Yes, definitely. So I could not agree more with Francesca. So the distinctions between the gaps that we see already evident in young people are reflected in the labor market later on. I mean, so in one of our latest studies, it's called Skills in the Digital Era. We use the survey of adult skills that is an internal product, a data set constructed here at the OECD. We actually examine 6 task-based skills, so 6 skills of adults, which are based on the tasks they perform on the job and the literacy and numeracy proficiency of adults. And we examine this between, we created a distinction between workers who are employed in digital-intensive sectors and workers employed in less digital-intensive sectors. And we actually try to assess which of these 8 skills are in highest demand in the respective segments of the economy. We actually find, when every other observable characteristics of individuals is taken into account. So we find actually that some skills are especially rewarded in digital-intensive sectors and not in less digital-intensive sectors. And these are self-organization, management and communication skills, and advanced numeracy, or what we used to call STEM skills. Now, this is, of course, the reflection of the fact that the digital economy likely requires a more decentralized way of working, it's continuously changing, so it requires continuous adaptability for workers. It implies less routine work, etc. Now, relevantly for the question here, we also find that these 3 skills, which are in highest demand in digital-intensive sectors, are also displayed more frequently by men than by women.
But I was just going to say the opposite, because aren't women better known as being better communicators, better working with teams, and all that?
Right. So, first of all, it's all conditional on women that are at work, right? I mean, so and second of all, we also this may be true on the general, when we look at women when we test women for these abilities themselves, but perhaps there are other factors that contribute to their better endowment in social skills, which we actually take into account in our analysis. So we say this independently on the women's sector of men's and women's sector of employment, occupational employment, attainment in tertiary education, age, experience on the work, etc. So while this may be true on the population of women, even at work more in generally, we are really trying to compare men and women at the same stage of professional and educational attainment.
Well, I mean, on the collaborative aspect, what we do know in terms of the skill displayed by the not yet workers, in other words, 15-year-olds in 2015 who will be workers down the line, is that girls tend to perform considerably better than boys in collaborative problem-solving skills. In other words, in aspects of goal-oriented collaboration to solve specific tasks. Then the issue remains to what extent they're able and given the opportunity to put these skills to use. One of the things that we do know is that differences in achievement and differences in skills and potential tell only a small part, if any, of the entire story as to why men and women are not equally likely to enter STEM occupations and eventually succeed in these occupations. What we do know is that stereotypes, for better or for worse, are still alive and kicking. The mothers and fathers of 15-year-old boys and girls are not equally likely to expect their sons and their daughters, for example, to enter a STEM occupation, even when their sons and daughters have similar levels of achievement in mathematics and science, for example. They tend to overestimate the possibilities for boys to enter such occupations. We know that teachers often hold stereotypes, but we also know that students themselves, with girls, for example, underestimating their mathematics abilities and overestimating the abilities in mathematics that are required to succeed in a job.
But do you think that the girls are doing that? I mean, where does that come from? I mean, does that come from actually their families and their teachers who are kind of subtly and maybe not so subtly giving them certain gender stereotype messages about where they should be aiming, what they should be thinking about themselves in their future?
If it's a combination of factors, and definitely there is a contribution on the part of the education system, both in terms of being part of the problem, but also being part of the solution. There are a number of studies, for example, that show that the variation across countries in the size of the gender gap in mathematics achievement is associated with the level of gender inequality in a society. In other words, the opportunities for men and women to participate in the labor market and to be part of political decision makers. So what happens is that the gender gap in favor of males is considerably stronger in countries that are less gender equal as societies overall.
Yeah, so by all means, I didn't want to attribute the entirety of gender disparities to disparities in skills. Absolutely, in our own study, we also find that there is a large unexplained component, say, of the gender wage gap. Once again, not explainable by the observed characteristics that we take into account. So, and that definitely speaks about the discrimination or self-selection of women in certain occupations as well. So I didn't want to give the wrong idea here, and it's definitely the case that stereotypes are alive and kicking, as Francesca has mentioned. So it has they're so alive. Even in the digital economy as we think we know it nowadays. For instance, like last year, a study on Uber drivers. Often we bring forward Uber drivers as a good example, like Uber as a good example of the potential of the digital economy to bridge the gender divides, because indeed the proportion of Uber drivers who are female is considerably larger than the proportion of taxi drivers who are female. Mm. But then this study by Cook, Diamond, and Hall show is that the wage gender gap is still there even
among Uber
drivers, and it's about 7%. And this is entirely explainable by preferences of drivers on the areas where they want to take their rides, the experience they have with the platform, the Uber platform, and their preferences on speed, right? And for instance, not their preferences on hours of work, right? Like working during the night versus working during the day. So of course, the digital economy has huge potential to solve gender disparities, but it's not a panacea for everything. And here, the study exactly shows that the gig economy can still sustain gender discrimination, right?
That's very disappointing, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, on the other hand, I mean, it needs not be only a negative story, and the technology itself has the potential, like a wider spreading of the technology itself has the potential to turn the table. And here we should be talking about why, or at least I think one interesting question is, why is the divide in digital access still so pronounced? It is indeed the case, as you were mentioning in introduction, that much fewer women have access to the internet.
Now, why is that?
Well, of course, it's a very complex phenomenon. Aside for, of course, cultural preferences, in some countries, use of technology has always been the domain of men, and hence having women that try to access it is badly considered. But aside for that, which is especially thorny to approach, we can talk about simply lack of funding. So like
lack of what? Sorry?
lack of funding, lack of resources. So the World Wide Web Foundation in 2017 released their Women's Right Online report that says that like in which they interview women, and they report that the two most important concerns for women in accessing the internet is that they cannot afford it, or it's too expensive to do so. I mean, this is of course like a worldwide study, so there's probably like a developing countries versus developed country component, but nevertheless the evidence is there, right?
Which seems again to underscore that at root we're talking about problems with social norms. That, you know, if women are finding this difficult to access financially, let's say, is it because that women are paid less, and so ergo these problems, or women are not allowed to, in their culture, be at the same level as men, and
I think this actually underscores also the importance of strong institutional frameworks and regulation. Another reason why women oftentimes do not access the internet is that it's either perceived or it's actually not a safe place for them to engage with. What we do know is that girls, even in the PISA study, tend to access the internet a bit later than boys do, even in highly developed countries. Probably this reflects a perception on the part of parents that the internet is not as safe for girls to engage in as it is for boys. That means rather than keeping girls away from the internet and being able to acquire the skills that will enable them to be expert consumers and possibly producers of digital content, the issue is making sure that the internet is a safe place for them to engage with, and actually that adult women contribute more in terms of content so that they can actually help to create a space that is more female friendly.
And that brings me to a question. Now that we have increasing numbers of women who have been brought up in the internet age and in the digital age, and who are trying to make an inroads into the tech industry, will that eventually kind of trickle down to younger female users who then may be more encouraged to participate, who may be more encouraged to pursue STEM studies? Or are we going to be sitting here in another 5 years in International Women's Day talking about the same problem?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to the last part of your question. It's certainly the case that things at work or in the science world and in the tech industry are changing. Although of course equality is still pretty much far away. So the OECD has has produced a report to the G20 last year, called Empowering Women in the Digital Age, where we report a number of pieces of statistics where we see how access or participation of women to say science or the production of innovation in the form of patents is still lagging behind, but at the same time how this is growing in some of the dimensions at a faster pace than the general population. So definitely, and in particular I'm referring to patents. So the patents that are filed by teams that are composed of at least one woman, which is not so obvious. Actually, in 2015, still 80% of patents were filed by teams of inventors who are exclusively
men.
Yeah, 80%.
And
right?
this was how long ago?
2015.
Just 3 years ago. 4
Yeah,
years
but
ago.
I want to for once try to portray a positive picture, right? I mean, so
we'd
so
like
actually,
to end on a positive note.
if you take the growth of patents filed from 1994 to 2014 for the overall G20 countries, like the growth of patents filed by teams where at least one woman inventor is present is way faster than the average patent, and it's actually faster in ICT in the ICT technology field than in the than other patents in ICT in the ICT
That's
field.
interesting.
Yeah, so this is a very good sign. But then, of course, I think we all recognize that there is a role for the so-called glass ceiling in stimulating workers to engage in STEM occupations, workers and students in engaging in STEM education and staying occupations later on in the labor market.
Yeah, I mean, I think a success story for education systems is that nowadays the main message is that there is gender parity, for example, in terms of science achievement, and the gender gap in mathematics, when there is actually small, and it has closed in a number of countries. So gender gap in science and mathematics is not destiny. It can be closed, and it has been closed. The problem remains in terms of how this translates in occupational preferences and eventually in entrance in specific fields. In PISA 2015, students were asked to which extent they expected to work in different fields by the age of 30. And while 4.8% of boys on average across the OECD expected to work in ICT occupations, only 0.4% of girls expected the same. This is obviously a problem in terms of the extent to which these expectations will in fact be realized, but also in terms of the effort that boys and girls decide to put in their studies. If you do not expect to enter a field, you will not put effort into coursework and building skills that will enable you to work in such fields.
So how can we encourage girls? Can we encourage girls? What's required here? I mean, the tech industry is well known, is notorious for being hostile to women.
Right. So I think that there are some perhaps more bottom-up approaches, which are perhaps not so invasive, such as stimulating companies to produce voluntary targets for their female participation, especially in top positions. There have been already initiatives to break the glass ceilings in terms of creating quotas. So forcing companies as well as public institutions to put enough a certain number of women, a certain proportion of women in board of directors in higher layers of the hierarchy. Now, this is not neutral, right? So, very recent evidence for Norway and actually for Italy as well has shown that, of course, these mandatory quotas increase the number of women that are in board of directors, but they are not necessarily very good at increasing the number of women in other top positions or in other positions overall in the same companies.
Yeah, however, what they can work for is actually changing the incentive structure or the expected benefits for the next generation. So in other words, young girls can see role models they can model themselves onto and actually may have an added advantage when trying to pursue those careers. I do think that what the education system can do is actually provide career guidance, much stronger career guidance that is very much tailored at fighting stereotypes. So working with teachers, working with families, but also working with students to change stereotypes. We know that stereotypes are not immutable. The stereotype in the 60s was that programmers were women, that females were inherently better at coding because they were notoriously detail-oriented, conscientious, and very perseverant. The stereotype of programmers these days is actually very much fitting the nerd kind of young man rather than the detailed-oriented woman. So stereotypes can and do change, and working with schools, but also society more widely, involving companies as well as civil society, can actually bear the promise of making sure that women reap the benefits of digital transformations.
So Luca, how can we turn things around then?
So it's quite clear that so access to digital technologies, provided that it's equitable across genders, can also imply access to more knowledge, potentially access to training that then can help women as much as men, of course, move forward. While we do have evidence, for instance, nowadays training is supplied more frequently to men than to women. So the access to digital technology, to distance learning, to more flexible work arrangements once the woman is at work, can favor like the development of certain competencies as much as the growth in the career of women. So, of course, now the question remains: how do you provide equitable access to digital technologies? And we so in this sense, there is plenty that that governments can do. They can provide specific funding for women that are targeting women. They can influence the behavior of the banking sector, for instance, which has been shown to be notoriously biased towards funding men entrepreneurs versus women entrepreneurs. And that's mostly because, well, I mean, no, I can't really create a causality link, but it certainly contributing factor to this is that most people who are evaluating projects to be funded are men, and they do and not women. So there is a certain reproduction. There's a certain love for the similar rather than the dissimilar.
Well, I think we'll end this on this somewhat optimistic note. I desperately want to be optimistic about this. Thank you very much again, Luca and Francesca, for your thoughts on all of this. And thanks to all of you for listening. Please don't forget to check out our Twitter page, which can be found at OECD EduSkills, as well as our OECD Education Today blog. Thank you again for listening, and see you next time.